I'm lucky to be an Uber driver, and over the past 4 years, I've encountered some unusual situations, but this particular night was by far the scariest of my life, and it almost ended my life. It only happened last month. It was late at night, and my city is small enough to avoid the hustle and bustle of a bustling metropolis, with a population of just under 1 million. If you prefer a quieter setting, it's a short drive to the countryside or forest. I was fine with the silence since I don't need to talk constantly. His destination was outside the city in a rural area, and the drive would take about 30 minutes. As I drove, I kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror. He hadn't spoken much so far, and while the silence wasn't bothersome, there was something off about him. I'm used to all kinds of passengers, drunk people being the most common at this hour. But this guy wasn't drunk. I could tell. You develop a sense for it in my line of work. He was absorbed in his phone, and his expression troubled me. He looked angry, like a manager frustrated with his employees. I wondered what was going on, but I didn't make it my business. I continued driving. I took a turn onto a country road, and the smooth pavement gave way to rough gravel. The street lights disappeared, but the full moon provided enough light for me to see ahead. I checked my phone's map, and although his final destination wasn't far, there was nothing around, just a cornfield to the right and a forest to the left. Are you sure this is right? I asked. We're almost there, he replied. That was the first full sentence I'd gotten from him. After a few minutes, I saw light in the distance. At first, I wasn't sure what it was, but as I got closer, it became clear that it was a truck. There was a man in the front seat, though I could only barely make him out. I stopped in front of the truck, and my passenger quickly jumped out, shutting the door behind him. He climbed into the truck, and I watched in confusion. Why would someone get an Uber only to meet up with a friend at such a remote location? Why wouldn't his friend just pick him up? I didn't dwell on it. At the time, about half a mile from where I left him, I lost control of my car. All 4 tires seemed to burst at once. I swerved left and right, struggling to stay on the road, and eventually came to a stop. I sat there trying to catch my breath, then got out to inspect what happened. Sure enough, all 4 tires were flat. It wasn't a coincidence. Something was definitely wrong. Without thinking, I ran into the woods next to the road, hiding behind a tree and waiting. After a minute or two, bright headlights appeared behind my car. It was the truck from before. This time there were 3 men inside. One was my passenger, the second was the man I'd seen earlier, and the third I hadn't noticed before. They stopped in front of my car, and I left my phone behind. I was tempted to curse aloud, but stopped myself. By then I was almost certain I had fallen into a trap. They must have tampered with my tires somehow. Maybe the third guy had laid out a spike strip when I passed by earlier. The 3 men got out of the truck and walked toward my car. Where's he? One of them said. He can't be far. Hearing that, I feared for my life. I pulled my head behind the tree, trying to stay out of sight. I listened as they searched through my car. I kicked myself for leaving my phone. I was sure there had been service earlier, but maybe there was a dead spot they had planned to take advantage of. After a few minutes, the truck drove away. I was relieved they didn't come looking for me, and I took my chance to start walking through the woods. It would be a long, hour-long walk back to the main road, but I couldn't risk taking the road and being caught. Eventually, I made it to the road and flagged down a passing car. The driver called 911 for me, and the police arrived at the scene. I told them everything. We went to a nearby rest stop to talk further. One of the officers called for backup, and they headed to the spot where it had happened. When they returned, an officer showed me pictures from the scene. It was the right spot. The skid marks from my burst tires were clearly visible, but my car was gone. I never found out why they let me go. It wouldn't have been difficult for them to find me. I'm just thankful to be alive, and although my tormentors remain unfound, I've been driving a taxi for over 10 years, and I've seen it all, from cheerful and talkative Passengers to those who keep to themselves, yet nothing could have prepared me for the night. I picked up a passenger who changed my life. It was a chilly night, the kind that makes you want to stay indoors and curl up under the covers, but duty called, and I had to keep working. As I drove around the city searching for my next fare, I spotted a man standing on the corner. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his hands tucked into his pockets. Suddenly, he pulled one hand out and signaled for me to stop. He opened the back door and climbed in, closing it behind him. I noticed he seemed a bit anxious, glancing around the car as if searching for something. I greeted him and he nodded in response. "Where to?" I asked. He gave me an address on the other side of town. I shifted into gear and started driving. I tried to make small talk to ease the silence, but he was polite yet distant, answering my questions with brief responses. Along the way, he changed his mind and asked to be taken to a different address. We drove through a quiet, dimly lit street. Then he told me to stop in front of an old abandoned building. I hesitated, unsure of why anyone would want to go there. Still, he assured me it was safe. When we parked, he instructed me to wait in the car. I watched as he approached another man standing on the street. This second man had a shaved head and numerous tattoos, a stark contrast to my passenger, who looked like a typical businessman. I was about to drive away when I saw my passenger returning, followed by the intimidating man. Both got into the back seat. My passenger gave me directions to continue driving. Despite feeling uneasy, I couldn't refuse. As we drove, the two men spoke in hushed tones. I could only catch a few words, but I started to worry that I was being used in something criminal. My heart began racing. I knew I had two options: go along with whatever they were planning and report it afterward, or act right away. A police station was only a few blocks away, and I decided to head there. I made a sharp turn and pressed the gas pedal. As we neared the station, my passenger suddenly pulled out a gun and pointed it at me. "Don't even think about it," he said, his voice cold. I knew it was too late. The police station loomed ahead. I stopped the car and the two men bolted out. They fled into the night. My hands were trembling and my heart pounded in my chest. After regaining my breath, I walked into the station and reported what had just happened. The men were captured on security cameras, and I described them to the best of my ability. The next day, the police called me in for an interview. They had apprehended the two men and wanted my help identifying them. I saw a list of suspects when I got to the station, and I recognized my passenger right away. I pointed him out, and the police took him into jail. The other guy was also put into custody since there was evidence connecting him to the crimes. The fact that they were no longer on the streets and could not hurt anybody else over time made me happy. Even though I've been scarred by other terrifying situations, the memory of that night started to fade. When I was around 10 or 11 years old, my family traveled to Florida to visit my grandparents. They lived in a small town on the Gulf of Mexico, where the weather was warm and the beaches were beautiful. I always looked forward to these trips because I lived in the north, where the weather wasn't great all year round. Perhaps one day I'll share those stories as well, but this particular night is undoubtedly one I won't forget. We usually went in March when my brother and I had a week off from school. We always left early in the morning, well before the sun even started to rise. My dad drove most of the way, but my mom would occasionally take over so he could rest. The trip was long and we would drive straight through the night, with my dad taking the night shift. We made sure to stop every once in a while to stretch our legs and grab a quick bite. One of our stops was at McDonald's, thinking it would be a fast and simple meal. While standing in line, a man started yelling at my dad, accusing him of cutting in line. My dad tried to explain that he wasn't cutting, but the man wouldn't listen. My mom stepped in to defuse the situation, but the man was too angry. I remember feeling scared and wanting to hide, but my dad stayed calm and didn't engage with the man's aggression. After we finished eating, we got back into the car and continued on our way. However, we soon realized that the man from McDonald's was following us. We tried to ignore him, hoping he would turn off onto a different road, but he kept following as I watched him from the back window, and it made me feel very uneasy. My brother started crying, and my parents realized right away that we needed to contact the police. When my mom asked my dad what we should do, he advised her to ignore him and that soon the guy would get tired and leave us alone. Suddenly, the man struck our vehicle from back, forcing it to swing. After my mom called 911, she spoke calmly and steadily to the operator, even though I could tell she was trying to protect my brother and me. A few minutes later, we heard sirens and saw a police car pull up behind us. The other car continued to drive, and the police car followed the man. Another police car pulled up behind us, and an officer came up to us and informed us that the man had been arrested. He had been drinking, and we were informed that he was already on probation for prior violent crimes. Behavior: my dad opted to just go on the vacation after assessing the damage to our vehicle. The bumper had a big hole where he had slammed us, but the police stated it was safe. The remainder of our trip was full of laughter and fun as we spent time with our grandparents in the Florida sunshine. We visited the beach, ate delectable seafood, and explored the small town where my grandparents lived. As we drove home, I reflected on how fortunate we were to have survived that ordeal. Highway accidents are common, and we almost got run off the road by that guy. Fortunately, that didn't happen. After my second year of college, I was able to purchase my first car. I couldn't have afforded one in high school, but student loans allowed me to purchase a used Toyota Corolla. I was driving back to my parents' house for the summer, which was a big step up from the bus rides I was used to. It was about an 8-hour drive, so I made sure to leave early in the morning. After a few hours of driving, I became bored and decided not to pick up anyone. I think it might be illegal where I live, but I'm not sure. After another boring half hour, I saw a hitchhiker at the side of the road. I slowed my car as I approached him to have a look at him before making a decision. He was a younger man, probably my age, wearing a jean jacket, brown pants, and running shoes. He had a scruffy beard. Just a regular-looking man. I thought. I stopped my car on the shoulder and he jogged over. "How's it going?" I said. "Great, thanks, man. I'm Pete," he said graciously. Then I unlocked the door. He got into the front seat and I started driving. We were actually hitting it off really well. He was super funny and we had a lot in common. The time seemed to fly by and eventually it had been over an hour. It was then that I realized that Pete never told me where he was going, so I asked him. He told me that his friend had a small hobby farm close to here and he was going to visit. He said he would get out on the highway and walk the rest of the way if I didn't want to take him all the way there. At this point I felt like the two of us had become friends, so I had no problem going a little off course to save him hours of walking. I told him I'd take him all the way to the farm and that he would just have to let me know where to get off the highway. We continued driving for a while and eventually Pete told me to take the next exit. I followed his instructions and he continued to direct me until we were on a pretty remote dirt road in the country. We were surrounded by cornfields, but it all seemed like a large-scale commercial farm, not the small hobby farm I was expecting. "Are we in the right place?" I asked. "Yeah, this is it," he said casually. Where is it?" I prodded. "We're here, just let me out," he insisted. I brought the car to a stop and Pete quickly got out. Without saying a word, not even a thank you, then he started walking down the road away from my car. This left me confused. We were in the middle of nowhere. There's no way this could be where he wanted to go, but what do I know? Although I was a little put off by his rudeness, I turned my car around and started driving back the way I came. The country road had been empty until now. I hadn't seen another car or person. or anything, however, that was about to change as I was making my way back to civilization. I saw a truck on the road. It was a black pickup truck. I'm not sure what make or model. It was stopped in the middle of the road, blocking my path. I was confused at first, but then I saw another truck approaching from behind. That was when I realized that I'd fallen into a trap. Pete must have been in on it. I had only a few seconds to decide what to do because the BAS was closing in on me quickly. I looked left and saw nothing but cornfields. After a few minutes in the field, I finally made it to the highway, where I turned onto it and received at least a few stares from the other drivers when they saw me emerge. It was a close call, but it could have ended much worse. I looked right and saw more cornfields, but the highway was barely visible in the distance. I thought I could probably make it there through the field, so I turned right and started plowing through it. However, the highway was a large target, and if I kept going straight, I would eventually arrive. What really irritates me about this experience is how easily Pete won my trust. Normally, I wouldn't let a stranger lead me into the middle of nowhere by myself, but after an hour of good conversation, I was willing to let my guard down, live, and learn. I guess stay safe out there, everyone. A few years ago, I drove my car across the country because it was something I'd wanted to do for a long time. So when I accepted a job on the West Coast, I decided to use that as an excuse to cross something off my bucket list. Of course, flying would have been quicker and less expensive, but I was really excited to see some of the often overlooked parts of America. But something happened during the trip that would make me regret that choice. I had planned for the trip to last a little over a week, so I would have enough time to see some sights and avoid driving after dark, which had always seemed really scary to me. It was day 5 of my trip, and I was ahead of schedule. Utah's border was fast approaching. The Rocky Mountains were in my rearview mirror, and the sun was about to set. Seemed like a good time to stop for the night. I had been lucky enough to find a motel almost every evening so far, and I only had to sleep in my car once. Up until that point, it wasn't a very good experience, so when I saw a sign for a motel on the highway, I felt relieved. I turned off at the next exit and followed the signs until I reached the motel. The bright neon sign stood tall in front of the parking lot, the sun almost set behind it. It was a single-level building that was wrapped around the parking lot in the shape of a L. I drove my car past the sign and parked in one of the many empty spots. There were 3 or 4 other cars there out of maybe 10 or 15 spaces. I walked to the office and rented a room for the night, then made my way to the other side of the building where my room was. When I walked in, nothing struck me as odd. It was a decently clean place with a bed and TV. What more could I ask for? One thing I did notice about the place was how thin the walls were. As soon as I stepped into my room, I could hear my neighbor chatting, but I could only hear one voice, so I assumed he was on the phone. I couldn't really understand what he was saying since it was so muffled by the walls that I could only hear every 5 or 6 syllables. It was a little annoyance, but nothing more. To get some sleep so I could get back on the road early in the morning, I jumped into the shower and brushed my teeth. When I went to bed, my head was essentially against the wall where I could hear my neighbor. It sounded like 2 people were arguing and talking, and I think I heard a few words in their muffled conversation that were slang for drugs, though I can't be certain. If the walls were thin enough that I could hear talking through them, I doubt they would stop a bullet. I lay there for a few minutes and heard nothing, so I was fairly certain it was safe, so I got up and called 911. Then, after a while, they were in a full-on shouting match, and I definitely heard some swearing. It was so bad that I almost called the police, but I decided it was none of my business. Then, something happened that still makes me shiver. I heard a loud, thunderous gunshot followed by silence. I suppose someone else had already called because I heard sirens before I even told the operator where I was. When the police showed up, they asked me a few questions, and I answered as best I could about the conversation I had overheard. Of course, I told them about the gunshot, and I later discovered that no one had been harmed. I assumed it was a warning shot, and both men must have left after that, and I never heard anything more. I slept through the rest of the night, and as soon as the sun came up, I resumed driving. Although this incident could have been much worse, it still occasionally makes its way into my thoughts. A few years ago, my partner and I had reserved a weekend stay at a charming bed and breakfast in a small town not far from our home. The drive took about 4 hours, through some remote stretches of highway. We took Friday off work to make the trip, and we planned to arrive by 4 p.m., so we'd have plenty of time to check in and possibly take a stroll around town. After an hour or two, the highway became nearly deserted, with only one lane in each direction. At one point, I asked my partner to change the music, and she pointed out that we had no self-service. We didn't need access to every song, so it wasn't a big problem, but it was part of the narrative. After an additional hour, we saw a vehicle stopped on the shoulder some 300 to 400 feet in front of us, so we assumed someone was having automobile difficulties. I'm a mechanic, so I thought it might be a quick fix, perhaps a flat tire or something simple. As we got closer, I saw a man standing by the car waving at us. He was of average height with a beard and a dirty baseball cap. He looked like someone who might know how to change a tire, but you never know. I stopped behind his car and got out while my partner stayed inside. He approached me, and we met halfway between our cars. I could see there were no flat tires, and the hood was popped. He introduced himself as James, very polite and friendly at first. He seemed genuinely relieved someone had stopped to help since there was no self-service on the stretch of road. We exchanged a few words, and he thanked me several times for stopping. Then he simply asked for a ride to the nearest town so he could call for help. I offered to take a look at his car instead, pointing out that often small issues could be easily fixed, saving a lot of hassle. In an instant, his friendly smile faded into a serious frown. He paused for a moment, then forced a smile back onto his face and said, "I wouldn't want to put you through that. A ride to town is really all I need." I felt uneasy at this. It seemed like he just wanted an excuse to get into my car. If my car had been broken down, I'd have been thrilled to have a mechanic offer to help. We stood there sizing each other up in silence for a few seconds. His forced smile began to fade again, and I said calmly, "I'm happy to look at the car, but that's all I can do for you the rest of." His smile vanished. He became angry. He went on a guilt-tripping tirade about how people no longer support one another. But I remained composed and made my way back to my car, where my partner was waiting. She asked me what had happened, so I told her briefly before we drove away. I was shaken, but we didn't let it ruin our trip. But the story didn't end there. About half an hour later, we stopped at a gas station to fill up. While I was refueling, I glanced over at the highway and saw a car passing by. To my shock, it was James from earlier. Our eyes locked for a brief second before he disappeared around a corner. That's when I realized I had made the right decision by not giving him a ride. He didn't want me to fix his car because he knew there was nothing wrong with it. I can only imagine what he would have done if I had let him into my car. My partner Hadn't noticed when he drove by, and I decided not to tell her right away because I thought it might spoil the rest of our trip. We ended up having a wonderful time and never saw James again. Still, I worry he might try this on someone else and they might not be as cautious. A few years ago, I worked part-time as an Uber driver while maintaining a full-time job that required me to work from home. My daily routine left me isolated. With hardly any real-life interactions, I thought driving for Uber would be a good way to get out of my apartment and engage with people from time to time. However, after a particular incident, I decided to quit and never look back. On one evening around 8 p.m. I set out as usual. Things were slow, and in the first hour I had only 2 passengers. The first was a group of college-aged girls heading to some kind of party on a Tuesday night. The second was a single woman, likely a waitress, on her way home from work. After that, I sat idle for 10 or 20 minutes. Eventually, I received a ride request from a user with no rating. While it wasn't a major red flag, everyone has to take their first ride at some point, it felt unusual. I accepted the request and drove to the pickup spot, which wasn't far from my apartment. In fact, I passed my building on the way. When I arrived, there was no one there, so I sent a message to my passenger named Telly. Moments later, I got a reply, "Be right there." It was riddled with poor grammar. I waited for a few minutes. Usually I'd leave after 10 minutes, but I kept an eye on the clock. After 7.5 minutes, a man approached my car. He introduced himself as Telly and he appeared to be in his early 20s with a long beard and wild, bushy hair. He was slightly overweight and wore thick framed glasses. I often try to start a conversation with my passengers, but his tone told me he didn't want to talk. "How's your night going?" I asked. "Fine," Telly responded, but his voice had a detached, uninterested tone. Telly spent most of the ride staring at his phone, occasionally glancing out the window in a troubled, wary manner. He seemed nervous, his hands were trembling, and he was sweating. I even thought he might have been crying recently, though it could have been from the stress. His presence made me uneasy, and I kept watching him through the rearview mirror as much as I could. Eventually, I noticed something alarming. His hands were gripping his phone tightly, and I could see pieces of blood on them along with cuts on his knuckles. At this point, I was really frightened, but we were getting close to our destination, so I decided to call it a night and go home. The following day, while I was working at my desk, I heard a loud knock at my door. I got up and cautiously approached through the peephole, and I saw 2 police officers. My heart fell, and my mind raced, trying to figure out why they were there. I opened the door slowly and said nothing, but one of the officers explained that they were looking for a suspect who was wanted for the mugging and severe beating of an elderly man. As soon as he said that, I thought of Telly, and they showed me a picture of him. I shared everything I knew with them, including details from my Uber account and dashcam footage. I don't know what happened to Telly after he was detained that day, but I tried looking for news reports about the event but couldn't find anything. As a result, I quit driving for Uber. I'm Jane, and I'm in my final year of graduate school, studying pharmacology. I find that I work best at night, so I usually spend my evenings studying at the library until quite late. At my school, the library is open until midnight most nights of the week, so it wasn't unusual for me to stay there until 2 or even 3 in the morning. The risks for drivers are just not worth it to me anymore. It's a big, contemporary, 4-story building with a computer room on the main floor. The other floors are filled with bookshelves and different study spaces. I always look for a peaceful place where I won't be bothered. One Thursday night, I arrived late, but I wasn't really getting anything done. I had my laptop out and was mostly watching YouTube videos. Eventually, I decided to call it a night because it was well past midnight, so I knew the buses wouldn't be running, so I packed up and left through the big glass doors at the front of the library while I waited for my ride. A red sedan pulled up shortly after I checked the status on my phone. I got in and greeted the driver, a man in his mid-30s with a disheveled beard, thick glasses, and a winter hat. Despite the fact that it was April, his style had a hipster vibe, so he said hi back. We began driving while I was playing a game on my phone, and the driver made a few attempts to talk to me, but I ignored him and went back to my game. Eventually, he stopped trying to engage, and we continued on our way. I didn't feel any particularly creepy vibes at that point. We arrived at my place without incident, and he dropped me off in front of my building. I lived in a first-floor apartment in an old house divided by floors with separate entrances for neighbors above and below. I thanked the driver quickly and shut the door behind me. As I looked back, the driver was still sitting there directly under a street light, staring up at me. As soon as he saw that I noticed him, he turned away. I closed the door and went to bed, falling asleep right away. The following week, I began feeling as though I was being watched at home. My apartment was on the ground floor with my bedroom at the back overlooking an alley that didn't see much foot traffic. However, I started noticing a dark figure walking past my window frequently. At first, it didn't alarm me, but one night I thought I saw him trying to peer through the window. I always kept the curtains closed, but I could see a little bit through them. When I got closer, the figure disappeared. At that point, I started feeling creeped out and thought I might be being stalked. However, I couldn't prove it. I worried that if I told anyone, they'd think I was just imagining things, so I kept it to myself. Not long after, I was studying late at the library again. It was around 11:30 when I decided to call it a night. I called an Uber and waited at the front of the building as usual. This time, though, I felt paranoid, so I entered a destination a block or so away from my actual address, thinking it would keep my location private. When my ride arrived, it was that same red sedan from before. I hadn't recognized him right away until I got in and saw his face again. I used Uber often, but this was the first time I had seen the same driver twice. As I got into the car, he seemed surprised to see me. Our eyes connected through the rearview mirror, and a chill ran down my SP line. I don't know why, but he really creeped me out this time. The car started moving, so I figured I would just take the ride. When he dropped me off in front of my building, I was relieved. I went across the street, opened my front door, and went to bed. As I lay there trying to sleep, I realized that I had entered a nearby address as my destination, but the driver had dropped me off right in front of my place. Perhaps he had a good memory, but even so, I thought they were supposed to follow the app. After what seemed like an hour or so, I fell asleep, but when I woke up, I heard a banging sound on my window. A dark shadow moved behind my curtains outside the window, and I watched in horror as the noise continued, as if someone was trying to force it open. My phone was on the bed, so I rushed over, grabbed it, and dialed 911. I was startled by the noise and quickly sat up. I quickly closed the door to my bedroom and moved the couch in front of it. The police arrived within minutes, and they caught my would-be attacker in the act. One of the officers met me at the front of the house and tried to calm me down on the porch. Then I saw another officer escorting the man in handcuffs. It was that creepy driver from before. I bet you didn't see that coming. I thanked the police officers for arriving so quickly, otherwise he might have gotten away. That night I stayed with a friend, and for the next few nights I moved out of that place. Now I have a much safer home. This happened last year when I was driving across the country alone to visit family on the East Coast. At the time I lived in Texas, and I'm afraid of flying, so I tried to avoid it whenever possible. I had made this trip a few times before and actually enjoyed having the time to myself. The trip would take 2 solid days of driving, so I would stop at a hotel or motel for a night. Along the way I was about to hours into my journey and needed to use the bathroom, so I pulled into a rest stop I had visited many times before. I wasn't far from home after all. I got out of my car and started walking toward the building when a truck pulled up next to me and someone started trying to talk to me. It was a large white transport truck, a full-sized 18-wheeler that appeared to have a full load. The truck was still running, so I couldn't hear what he was trying to say clearly. I think he offered me a ride or something. But I don't know why, because nearly everyone at that rest stop had arrived by car. I didn't think about it much at the moment, so I went into the bathroom. When I came out, the truck was gone, so I walked back to my vehicle and drove on. I didn't sure what to do, but I didn't want to seem impolite, so I simply smiled and nodded before leaving. The incident quickly slipped my mind as I continued my journey. After a few more hours, I glanced through my rearview mirror and noticed a large white truck trailing behind me in the distance. My mind went back to that guy from before, but there was no way to know for sure if it was him. White trucks are common, so it wasn't particularly concerning. Still, I couldn't help but keep an eye on my mirror for the next few hours. I didn't see the truck again. As the sun began to set, I started looking for a hotel or motel near the highway. There was a truck stop on the left side of the road with a small motel next to it. Though it wasn't luxurious for the situation, it was perfect. There was even a restaurant, which was a welcome sight since I was really hungry. After a full day of driving, I parked in the mostly empty lot and headed to the office. I rented the cheapest room and then went to the restaurant. After finishing my meal, I walked back to my room, but noticed something odd in the truck section of the parking lot. There was a truck that strongly resembled the one I had seen earlier. I walked over and peeked into the window, but it was empty. Afterward, I returned to my room, locked the door, and laid down on the bed. I fell asleep almost instantly. It was only around 9:30 p.m. But I was really tired from the day. The next thing I remember is waking up in the dark room. I could hear a noise coming from outside my room, a kind of metallic grinding sound coming from my door. I got up and approached it, then peeked through the window. There was someone out there, a man, and he was doing something to my door, trying to break in. I assumed the worst and ran over to my phone, calling 911. The man must have heard me talking to the police, because when I checked again, he was gone. I told him that someone was trying to break into my room nearby, and there was a security camera. The police then showed me an image of the man, and it was the same guy from before. I told them about his truck and the incident at the rest stop, and with that information, they were able to find and arrest him. What's even more unsettling is that I thought I was being paranoid at the time, but it turned out that I was being stalked. I'm grateful every day that I woke up at the right time, because if he had entered my room while I was asleep, it would have been a truly horrible roommate. I've been driving trucks since I was in my early 20s, and I was 35 at the time of this incident. The roads were always very quiet for the first few hours of the day, which is nice, having the road to myself for a while, especially since driving on busy roads can be pretty dangerous. I was driving down a road I don't usually use because the stretch of my normal route was closed for construction, so I had to take an alternate route. I was hauling garbage across the border between Canada and the United States. To be honest, it's not my dream job, but I make over $90,000 a year, and I never finished high school, so it's not all bad. I usually start work at 6 a.m. The road I was on wasn't exactly a highway, just one lane in each direction with forest on both sides. It was just past 6 o'clock in the morning. I had just started my day, and the sun was barely up. It was early April in northern Michigan, and the morning was cold, probably around freezing. My hands were shaking on the wheel because the truck still hadn't warmed up completely. I leaned over to turn up the heat when I noticed the empty cup holder in the center console. I Really wished I had picked up a coffee on my way out. When I looked back up at the road, I saw something moving in the woods on the right side. I jerked my head around trying to catch a better look, but it was gone. It looked like a person, but I only got a quick glimpse, so I wasn't sure. There were definitely deer in the area, but I hadn't seen many that year. I pulled the truck over to check if it was someone who needed help. The spot was far from anything, and I didn't see a car pulled over anywhere nearby, so it really could have been somebody who needed help. Once I stopped the truck after opening the driver's side door, I went into the woods and looked around. There was nothing there, so I called out to someone but got no response. The eerie atmosphere made me feel both scared and curious, so I continued walking until I came to a spot where I thought I had seen the figure. When I got there, I noticed that I was standing over a pile of bloody clothes with a piece of D-tape attached to one of them. I quickly looked up and scanned the area, but I couldn't see anyone. The forest was sparse, and I could see a fair distance in all directions, but the coast was clear, so I turned around and sprinted back to my truck. After locking the door and jumping into the front seat, I called 911. The spot was a fair distance from the nearest town, but the police arrived in less than 10 minutes. We went back to that spot in the woods, but there was nothing there. I was sure I had led them back to the right spot, but it was simply empty. I was worried the officer would think I was lying, but he took it very seriously and called for backup. There was a search in the forest based on my report, but nothing was ever found. It's been almost 2 years since this happened, and I've been keeping a close eye on the news since. I haven't seen any reports of missing people or bodies found to this day. I have no idea what happened, but somebody was definitely up to something. I recently made a career shift, but I used to drive long-haul trucks. One evening I was traveling through the Midwest and it was getting late. The air was cool and the wind whistled through the small gap at the top of my window. The road was lonely and I hadn't seen another vehicle for quite some time. However, after a while I noticed a car in my rearview mirror. At first I didn't think much of it, but as I continued driving, the car stayed right behind me. When I saw a sign for a rest stop, I thought it would be a good idea to take a break, possibly even to call it a night. I decided to pull into the rest area to see if the car would follow, and when I parked my truck, the car pulled in right next to me. Most drivers are eager to pass, but this car wasn't. I had to strictly follow the speed limit, but most cars tend to speed up a bit. When I stepped out of my truck and moved to the front of the vehicle, I could hear the engine running, and when I turned to look, the driver was gazing at me. This was strange since there were distinct areas for trucks and automobiles. The vehicle was quite recent, most likely a Toyota from 2005, but it was difficult to determine the precise color in the dark. It may have been silver or gray, and the right fender had a large ding. I cautiously waved at the driver to get his attention, but he just kept staring straight ahead. I could only tell that he looked about my age, wore glasses, had dark hair, and a mustache. Suddenly, the car's engine roared to life, and it started to move toward me. I had to move to the side just in time, and as I did so, I saw that the car's brake lights glowed brightly as it quickly reversed toward me. I was able to hide behind my truck, and while I was hidden, I heard the car screech to a halt, and then it sped away. I stood there in the middle of the truck stop, confused and afraid, wondering what had just happened, and why that car tried to run me over. I decided to call the police and tell them what I could, but I didn't have much to say. I even tried looking at the license plate as it drove away, but I couldn't remember the numbers. I chose not to stay there that night. I was too uneasy about the possibility of the car returning and causing harm. It was a few hours later before I found a safe spot to rest, and by then it was very late. I was restless the next day, staying alert every time I stopped for gas or food, constantly scanning the surroundings for any sign of that car. Later that day, while caught in a traffic jam on the highway, something common in such areas. When there's an accident, a different unrelated accident occurred. Up ahead, it wasn't in a busy city or during rush hour. When I finally passed the scene, I saw a flatbed truck carrying what I was pretty sure was that same car from the other night, along with another vehicle. The crash looked severe. I scanned the area for that strange driver, but couldn't see him. He was likely taken to the hospital, or worse. I still don't know what his intentions were out there, but I believe he caused that accident intentionally. I may never fully understand why. A few years ago I had a frightening experience with a stranger, and this story is about it. I live in a different city than my parents, so I would often make an 8-hour drive to visit them at least once or twice a year. I always made the trip in a single day, starting either in the morning or early afternoon. It was late October, and I was more than halfway there. The sun was starting to set, casting an orange glow on the landscape. As I drove down a quiet road, I noticed a transport truck pulled over on the side. This hazard lights were flashing. At first I wasn't sure if anyone was inside, but as I got closer I saw that the driver's door was slightly open. I decided to stop, thinking someone might need help. I stepped out of my car and walked toward the truck. There was no one inside, but I saw a wooded area next to it. I called out, "Hello, is anyone?" There was no response. As I turned to walk back to my car, I heard a noise behind me. I quickly turned around and saw a man standing there. He was holding a gun and pointing it at me. He was a big man, probably around 5 feet 10 inches, but muscular. The man didn't say anything, keeping the gun trained on me. I was unable to talk or think straight, so I backed up slowly and continued doing so until I was close to my vehicle. I kept my eyes on him the whole time, cautiously opening the door and getting inside. And once I was locked in, I turned on the engine. I drove as quickly as I could toward my family's town after seeing the guy drop his pistol in my rearview mirror. My pulse was pounding as I attempted to comprehend what had occurred. I had never been in a scenario like this before, and it was really scary. The scene kept playing over and over in my head, making it difficult for me to comprehend. The man could have easily shot me or stolen my car, but he didn't, and I thought that maybe he was as scared as I was. After giving it some thought, I wondered if the truck driver had something to hide. Perhaps there was something in his truck that he didn't want me to see, or maybe he was doing something in the woods that he didn't want anyone to know about. These thoughts crossed my mind long after the incident, so I'm not sure what is true. Eventually, I felt relieved when I got to my family's town, and they were shocked and grateful that I survived. Needless to say, we spent the rest of the evening chatting and catching up. I work as a truck driver and frequently take multi-day overnight trips, so I knew I had to stop for the night. When it got late one evening, I pulled into a rest stop off the highway, which was small and could accommodate only 3 or 4 trucks at most. There was also a restaurant and a small restroom with a single shower, so I parked my truck and went inside for a shower before having dinner at the restaurant. I then climbed into the back of my cab and fell asleep, but I woke up to the sound of my own voice saying, "I really need to pee," not literally, but I really need to pee. I opened my eyes and checked my watch, which read 3 a.m. Despite my reluctance to get out of my vehicle, I had no option but to do so and crept to the restroom to wash my hands. I stood up and proceeded back toward my vehicle after hearing footsteps coming, which seemed odd since I hadn't seen anybody else. As I got closer, I saw a guy standing in front of it. He was around 6 feet tall, dark-haired, and wearing a filthy big sweatshirt and baggy trousers. A light to his right cast a huge shadow over most of his body. I tried to move past him to get back to my truck, but he blocked my path. His eyes were menacing, and before I could say anything, he pulled out a knife and pointed it at me. I was terrified, but I remained calm and slowly reached into my wallet and handed it to him. He took all of my cash and credit cards out of it, so I had very little, maybe $30, but he growled. I told him it was, but he didn't believe me, so he looked at my phone for a moment before ordering me to unlock it. I hesitated because my phone was my only lifeline, and without it, I wouldn't be able to call for help. I told him I would unlock it, but he didn't believe me. He was after me, but I was quicker, so I hopped inside the taxi and closed all the doors. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 when I saw the guy outside, still brandishing the knife, hammering on the glass and yelling profanities at me. I explained what had happened and gave them the address of the rest stop. I looked out the window and saw that the man had disappeared. No trucks or cars had moved since he vanished, so he couldn't have gotten very far. It seemed like forever, but it was only a few minutes. I saw flashing lights and a police car pulled up next to me. I spoke to the officers when they arrived, and they instructed me to wait in my truck while they searched the area. I did as they said, and after about 30 minutes, the man was appeared. I'm still unsure of where he was hiding or where he was running to, but what's even more perplexing is how he got to the rest stop in the first place without a truck or car. It was very unusual, and I barely slept the rest of the night. 4 a.m. had already arrived. After an hour or two of trying to unwind in my vehicle, the sun rose, and I resumed my drive. I work as a truck driver, and on this sunny April afternoon, my eyes were scanning the road ahead. In my line of work, I've seen a lot of strange things on the road, but this particular felt different because the sun was high and the air was humid. It had been a few days since I had really spoken to anyone, and I was getting lonely. I never heard anything about what happened to that guy because I was far from home and couldn't bring myself to follow up. I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, rolling down my window, needing a lift, when I noticed a young woman with long, curly hair, wearing blue jeans and a red hooded sweatshirt, with her thumb out in a desperate attempt to hitch a ride. We were driving along when I noticed a car following us. It was a police car, but its lights were off, so I didn't think much of it. Then I heard a siren and saw the flashing lights, and my truck was being pulled over. I stopped immediately, worried that I might be in trouble for picking up a hitchhiker, which is technically illegal where I live. She nodded and climbed into the cab of my truck, her eyes darting nervously. At the time, I assumed she was new to hitchhiking. I'm not an intimidating person by any means, but I was still a stranger, so I could understand her uneasiness. I waited for him to speak, but instead he ordered the woman to leave. When she did, I noticed that her face was flushed and her hands were shaking. I watched in confusion as the officer handcuffed her and took her to the squad car. I didn't realize what had happened until I heard him radio a report of a robbery at a nearby rest stop. She had robbed the store and was using my truck as a getaway vehicle. The officer put her in the back of the police car and then returned to speak with me, telling me not to pick up hitchhikers again and merely gave me a warning without a ticket. The experience left me shaken, but that wasn't the worst part. Later that night, I saw her story on the news, and it turned out that she had shot a man during the robbery. The gun had been in her backpack the whole time she was in my truck, so up until that point, it had been a good story for parties. But after that, I was really frightened.